Good afternoon, everyone. Here are a few words from some of our sponsors and partners.
𝐏 Philippines is a subsidiary of the startup accelerator 𝐏 International. With our affiliate 𝐏 Korea, we invest seed capital in promising startup companies. We invest in startups that work in EdTech, the Internet of Things, AR/VR, and AI machine learning. We practice 𝐇𝐚𝐥𝐥𝐲𝐮, or companionship, striving to help our startup partners solve the challenges they face as they grow. We record every step of the 𝐇𝐚𝐥𝐥𝐲𝐮 process to build an ever-adaptive yet foolproof methodology together. In addition, we run the website aboutkorea.com, where we collect the internet's most useful information on South Korea for travelers, expats, or anyone interested in the country. Despite the challenge of navigating through the raging current of economic uncertainty, We believe that our startups can make a way through constant perseverance. No tide is too great for those who dare to keep doing.
Welcome everyone to the third week of the Philippine-Korean Youth Forum 2022. As the elections for our country are only a few days from now, it is only relevant to allot this week's session for the delegates under the government and diplomacy track. A lot of us may be experiencing election anxiety right now, but worry not, as today's keynote lecture will focus on the South Korea and Philippine government relation. Before we proceed with that, let's do a quick check-in with our viewers who are watching live on Facebook and YouTube. Comment down below who you are supporting in this year's presidential elections. In this week's keynote lectures and forum, the topics are targeted for the delegates in the government and diplomacy track. Are the delegates from the government and diplomacy track tuned in already? If you are, comment what you are excited to learn from this day's session. Feel free to comment your questions in the comment section anytime during the lectures, and we'll be answering those during the open forum later on. For everyone who is streaming this and would like to share it on your social media accounts, please use the hashtag PKYF2022, hashtag #UPAriRang, and hashtag Bridging the Gaps. Also, don't forget to tag 𝐕𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐴𝐴 in your posts. As usual, we would like to thank our dear sponsors and partners for making PKYF 2022 possible. PKYF is presented by 𝐕𝐵𝐴𝐴𝐴. It is co-organized together with UP Korea Research Center, Pinoy Scholars sa Korea, Association of Filipino Educators in Korea, Busan University of Foreign Studies, United Korean Community Association in the Philippines, and the Office of International Linkages Diliman, OVCAA UP Diliman. It is made possible by APOP, JK Network Services, 𝐏𝐻 Philippines, Hi Local, and the Philippine Embassy in Korea. In cooperation with Aja Korean Talk, Tourism Promotions Board Philippines, and In Korean Podcast. This event would also not be possible without our partners. Our major partners are the Lasallian Student Ambassadors, Blue Hanguk Society, and UP DEBAC. Our minor partners are Anyong PNU, DEBAC UPM, and UE International Studies Society. This event is promoted by the Korean Cultural Center in the Philippines and also brought to you by Inquirer.net, InkPop, and Monster RX 93.1. Thank you to our dear sponsors and partners for their continuous support throughout the duration of our event. To kickstart our keynote lecture, let us first have a special performance that will surely bring excitement to our online audience. The performers are Chingus from Hallyu, who were claimed as soulmates since Freshie Orientation Day. Sharing their passion for performing and being fangirls of K-pop idols, they came together to reminisce lovely memories of their friendship. Let us all welcome Hallyu-P's duo, Jessie and Chi.
So are you happy now? Finally happy now, are you? 뭐 그대로야 난 다 잃어버린 것 같아. 모든 게 맘대로 왔다가 인사도 없이 떠나. 이대로는 뭐 또 사랑하고 싶지 않아. 나 해질 대로 해줘버린 기억 속을 여행해. 우리는 오렌지 태양 아래 그림자 없이 함께 춤을 춰. 정해진 별 따위는 없어. 아름다웠던 그 기억에서만 Now forever young. Forever young. 이런 안목이라면 영영 깨지 않을게. 섬, 그래 여긴 섬 들어가 만든 작은 섬. forever young. 원이라 말은 머리속 짝부름 마치 지천보자같이 구름을 같이 마루가라 아침 서로가 이어고 붙이나 거기 금에서 다시 만나 위로했던 누구의 말 따로 고작 한 병짜리 추억을 잊는 게 참 쉽지 않아. 시간이 지나도 여전히 날 붙드는 그곳에 우리는 오렌지 태양 아래 그림자 없이 함께 춤을 춰 정해지 안녕 따위는 없어 아름다웠던 그 기억이 속 만나 우리는 서로를 베고 누워 슬프지 않은 이야기를 나누어 오후 한겹말 따위는 없어 난 영원히 널 이 기억에서 만나 forever young. Forever young. 이러라고 이라면 영영 깨지 않을게.
Amazing! That was such a thrilling performance. Thank you to Jessie and Chi for gracing PKYF 2022 with their talents. Even I was singing along with the song. Now that we all feel energized after this special performance, we will no longer keep you waiting as we introduce the first speaker for tonight's keynote lecture. He is a poet, critic, and translator. He is an associate professor of broadcast communication at the College of Mass Communication, University of the Philippines, Diliman, where he teaches courses on the teleserye, communication, and television studies. To discuss the Hallyu phenomenon as soft power and its implications on the Philippines, let us give a warm applause to Mr. Louis John A. Sanchez.
Good afternoon, everyone. The title of my lecture is The Korean Turn in Philippine Popular Culture, The Story So Far. I begin with a personal story. It was in 2013 when I began to engage what was back then a growing field of studies on Hallyu or Korean Wave. There were interesting discussions going on from both the corporate and academic sectors. There were analyses about reception emerging from the network's research departments, while there were also initial interventions being offered by scholars. As I was trained in literary and cultural studies, I was mostly interested in Korean novellas and how they were reshaping our teleseries. I wanted to inquire why Filipinos could not get enough of these global drama products. By then, it has already been 10 years since the Korean novella was first introduced in the country. The first, Bright Girl, starring Jang Nara and Jang Hyuk, was aired by GMA Network in 2003. Bright Girl is the story of an ambitious provincial lass who goes to the city and serves as a maid to a rich household. In the household, she meets the arrogant 𝐿, who eventually falls in love with her. Bright Girl was back then a new offering in a Philippine television market saturated first by Latin American telenovelas, which became popular in the mid-1990s, and then by Chinese or Taiwanese drama, fondly called chinovelas or Taiwan novelas, which entered the television scene at the turn of the century in 2000. Both Latin American telenovela and the Chinese or Taiwanese drama have maintained a wide following among viewers by the time Korean novelas were introduced. I surmise that because of oversaturation, especially in prime time, the former was eventually relegated to afternoon and the late prime time airing, because befittingly, telenovelas were known for their steamy themes and uh, sensitive subjects or stories. This was the case until it was totally eased out or transferred to other platforms like the telenovela channel on cable TV. Launched in 2011, the telenovela channel has been airing a good number of telenovelas from Latin America, mostly dubbed in English. To date, I think it is the only one that still shows telenovelas. From time to time, there would be a handful of Chinese or Taiwanese drama shown on prime time. But mostly around 2010s, it was Korean novelas and teleseries that were lording over prime time after nightly news. There was also an observable reinnovation of teleseries happening back then because of the influence of the Korean novela form. We also began adapting Korean novelas. Local networks began to emulate the production quality and scale of Korean novelas, particularly the ones that have transnational narratives, meaning stories set in Korea and abroad. There surfaced teleseries that showcased stories that were set in the country and abroad. Though the gaze of the characters, as I argued, is entirely different. So the examples are on your screen. When Korean characters leave for another country, they usually go there to be a tourist or to study or to engage in multinational business. Whereas Filipino characters look at the foreign language or landscape usually as a migrant worker. In a paper published in 2014, I attempted to explain the phenomenal transformation brought about by Korean novelas into the teleserye. I called it the Korean turn. Another high point I asserted in teleserye evolution, which I was only able to articulate more coherently in my dissertation on the cultural history of the teleserye. For me, the concept of Korean turn is a productive approach in explicating the phenomenon not only of the popularity of the Korean novela in the Philippines, but also of the complex process of appropriation of Korean novela elements into the teleserye. Allow me to expand further on the concept of appropriation by reading and reviewing Richard Rogers. He describes cultural appropriation in this manner. Cultural appropriation defined broadly as the use of a culture's symbols, artifacts, genres, rituals, or technologies by members of another culture, capable when cultures come into contact, including virtual or representational contact. He continues, cultural appropriation is also inevitably intertwined with cultural politics. It is involved in the assimilation and exploitation of marginalized cultures and in the survival of subordinated cultures and their resistance to dominant cultures. Culture appropriation is inescapable, he says, but that is not to say all acts of appropriation are equal. Acts and conditions of appropriation vary in terms of the degree and relevance of voluntariness or involuntariness, equality or inequality, imbalance or balance, and purity or impurity. That there was a Korean turn ultimately showed how shifting audience preference is vital in elucidating the evolution of the televisual form of the teleserye. When the telenovela invaded the airwaves by way of the Marimar fever in 1996, the TV soap opera transformed to become more compact, realistic, and compelling. We turn our backs on the epical run of serial drama common in the 1980s, left the limiting studio setup for on-location shoots, and filled each episode with lots of sequences to make the narrative fast-paced and the storytelling intricate and nuanced. The Korean turn in teleseries opened the eyes of audiences and producers alike to other narrative and conceptual possibilities, especially as Korean novellas appeared to nudge networks about the ever-changing broadcast landscape in the era of globalization. In this ethos, production does not only serve local audiences, it also tends to a growing international market, diasporic Filipinos included. It has to catch up with superior production value of Korean novellas if it wishes to participate and be competitive in the growing global drama market. With regards to the Korean turn, the story so far is this. Contrary to what some believe to be the waning, and I wish to use the precise term back in the days, no, that there was impending death, the impending death of Hallyu in 2013, Korean novellas remain to be a steady part of our televisual diet. Even as television was radically revamped, reordered by the pandemic, people still follow, and today's term is to binge on Korean novellas wherever they are available. Free TV, for example, in streaming, even in contentious digital platforms. Binging became illustrative of people's new viewing behaviors, particularly in the middle to upper class. It brought viewers a sense of freedom in watching what, when, and how. It is a different and a bit democratized form of viewing, especially that binging is usually carried out through smartphones or tablets and away from conventional TV contraptions. While televiewing has somewhat changed in some, and this is quite unfortunate, most of the country do not have access to the platforms where binging takes place, primarily because of poor internet connection. Free TV remains to be most accessible, but its recovery remains to be seen, especially after the entire broadcasting industry was downsized by the pandemic and devastated by the highly politicized shutdown of ABS-CBN. In 2021, reports indicate that TV viewing has slid down to 61%. Nevertheless, both streaming and free TV continue to be the platforms for the continuously flourishing Korean novella market as well as the Korean turn. However, the Korean turn is not only true for teleseries. It is actually an extensive, expansive pop culture phenomenon that gained traction in the last 5 years. Apart from televisual formats, the Korean turn in the Philippines manifests in 3 other areas: tourism, culinary cultures, and music. In tourism, 2017 reports show that there were less than 450,000 Filipino visitors to South Korea. Meanwhile, there were more than 1.6 million South Korean visitors to the Philippines. It may have increased in the following years, perhaps if COVID-19 did not happen. In culinary cultures, we currently have the popularization of samgyeopsal-gi, which has turned into a burgeoning business for many. In music and even in film, K-pop lords it over in the global market, that in the process, Filipino producers got inspired to create our very own P-pop and boy or girl bands inspired by K-pop idols. Before this, there was an interest in recording local songs into Korean and a growing attraction to study the Korean language in independent language schools and universities. Now, I'm mentioning these examples to assert two things. No? That one, Korean novellas and the Korean turn in teleseries help spread and sustain interest in Korean culture. And two, the continued circulation of Korean culture not only shows the success of Korean soft power in conquering Philippine culture, but also Philippine culture's aptitude to appropriate cultures that enters its realm. For what purpose? I will explain later. As to the first assertion, no? It must be remembered that Korean novellas became the way from which Filipinos first glimpsed the sights and sounds of South Korea. And this love to Winter Sonata, the landmark Korean drama that started the Korean wave in 2002, introduced to Filipino audiences scenic destinations like Nami Siom or Nami Island. Nami Island, like many other Korea novella locations, has elected to tap into the popularity of Winter Sonata that landmarks, such as this one on your screen, have been put up around the area commemorating unforgettable scenes from the series. From the vantage point of Filipino audiences, the tourism enticement was by way of televisual nostalgia. Filipino tourists were able to relive the romantic moments of the star-crossed lovers Junsang and Eugene as they set foot in Nami Island. Meanwhile, the vast Korean culinary cultures was also popularized through another Korean novella, 𝐏𝐴𝐵𝐺𝐵 or Jewel in the Palace, a period drama that narrates the story of a court cook and Dr. Jang Gyum. The series introduced not only royal and day-to-day cuisine, but also native cooking techniques. The show appeared to have displayed the entirety of Korean cooking as Jang Gyum can only do, showing Filipino audiences that there are many more dishes to taste from Korea aside from kimchi. Korean novellas were also instrumental in the promotion of K-pop. Not a few K-pop members occasionally starred in Korean novellas, and acting in drama certainly boosted their popularity and star power and showed their versatility for audiences to adore. In a way, we may surmise that the waves of Hallyu in the Philippines were coming from many directions, like tourism, food, or K-pop. Arguably, what steered the flow are Korean novellas, being the most accessible Hallyu form on Philippine television and popular culture. Korean novellas made everything cohere and constantly reiterated. Korean novellas articulated the many facets of Korean culture and ideas because it was clearly the same species as the Philippines' popular and most loved dramatic and narrative TV form, the teleserye. This is the story of the Korean turn in the Philippines so far. This is the story of a steady cultural influx from South Korea that a good number of Filipinos patronize at this point of our highly globalized era. South Korea may be praised for many things, among them its soft power strategy to conquer the world through its popular culture that now defines and redefines global cultures. However, this account is without taking into consideration the ways that Philippine culture responded or even resisted as it was being surged over by Hallyu. As a post-colony, we had in us the capacity not only to cope with the stream of foreign cultures, but also to acquire useful facets of these foreign cultures for our own purposes, as by the Filipino literary critic Lucila Hosilios. Imitation, stylization, borrowing, these terms are almost always taken negatively as appropriation is concerned. For Hosilios, however, these are means to create something original, where there is an indivisible integration of all constituent elements through their interrelationships. Historically, the influx of the foreign has never stopped Filipinos to create, to originate from their very hands, pieces and practices of culture that show, still in the words of Hosilios, how they transmute such foreign elements into well-informed of their own personal experiences and realities. I think the other side of the story of the Korean turn. So it only became evident to me years after I have proposed the idea and treaded the path to writing a cultural history of the teleserye. After all, the teleserye, from its soap opera beginnings on radio and television to the current web series, is in itself an acquired form from our colonial experience, our American colonial experience. We were able to make it our own by way of imitation, stylization, and borrowing. The soap opera as teleseries found its own purpose in local shores, and that is to be the drama of Filipino life, distilling day-to-day experience as well as social affairs past and present. Sometimes it may even appear to directly refer to events and incidents in reality, perhaps for people to examine and eventually act upon. In my paper on the Korean turn in 2014, I pointed out how local imitations of the then Korean novella penchant and trope for setting stories in foreign soil, usually in the West, perpetuated the continued displacement, the diasporization of Filipino characters. Unlike Korean characters, I've said, who usually have the means and resources to indulge while visiting or bending their hearts in foreign lands, Filipinos go abroad in search for greener pastures, sporting an utterly different and often subservient gaze. That can be seen, for example, in how the adaptation of Lovers in Paris turned out. No? Thus, the story becoming diasporic, usually in the context of overseas contract work, like On the Wings of Love here. Expanding further my initial contentions on the Korean turn, I wish to review the rubric I have used earlier, tourism, food, and K-pop. These are, I believe, the same sites where we may find notable acculturations of Hallyu in the Philippine setting. In these acculturations, we were able to relocate what we have picked from South Korea and made them our own. Korean novellas introduce us to the idea of destinations and locations as drama story settings. Eventually, local productions followed suit and created fictional worlds out of places familiar to us. Baguio City has been a favorite relocation for recent teleseries. In 2014, a series titled Forevermore, starring Enrique Hill and Liza Soberano, brought audiences to the mountainous strawberry fields of a fictional community called La Presa, located in Tuba Benguet at the outskirts of Baguio City. The popularity of the soap eventually brought hordes of fans to Baguio, and more importantly, to the location in Tuba, which unfortunately brought traffic congestion and the accumulation of garbage in the area. This led eventually to the issuance of an environmental protection order, which set the site as off-limits to people for a period of time. I mean, it wasn't such a good case, since it opened a can of worms, among them the local government's incapacity and unpreparedness to manage this kind of increase in tourists motivated by teleserye viewing. Meanwhile, I'm certain that we get the point of the business model of Korean novellas subtly selling Korean or South Korean destinations in drama form. For Filipinos, It generates interests about the setting and encourages local tourism. Tourism creates jobs, though it transforms localities and threatens, to a certain extent, cultures. But we're still learning about this. Currently, another teleserie is airing on free TV, The Broken Marriage Vow, set in a fictional Baguio City. It is a franchise of BBC's Dr. Foster, which is, as we know, also a franchise of the Korean novela hit, The World of the Married. People are raving over the native designs integrated into the wardrobe of the characters, representing the work of indigenous weavers from the north, if I am not mistaken. The Broken Marriage Vow is another articulation of what we are learning so far about the sense of place being taught to us by Korean novellas. It appears that conjuring culture does not necessarily mean showcasing the sites and turning them into teleserye tourist attractions. It may actually simply be the distillation of culture for Filipino audiences in all the world to see. Meanwhile, as I am not a culinary expert, only a voracious eater, I cannot make any speculations about South Korean, Philippine culinary fusions taking place. There may as well be, but I am leaving that to be determined by food scholars. Allow me nevertheless to make conjectures about the way we engage eating samgyupsalgi. What makes it a Filipino experience, in my observation, how it had become a family and even a communal affair. Samgyup is meant to be shared, and the rise of samgyupsalgi places everywhere showcases tables upon tables of families and friends sharing grilled meat and plates upon plates of side dishes and greens. Samgyupsalgi version may be argued to be or to have become a fiesta, a coming together. It may as well have already replaced our 𝐒𝐿𝐵 or barbecue practices, since one doesn't have to leave home to partake of samgyupsalgi. It may be done at home. It has become part of our culinary repertoire, and perhaps also because we have seen it many times in Korean novellas. Lastly, as K-pop is vast, I will only be talking about how we have been making waves through our own P-pop. No? P-pop was a term I was not a fan of in the beginning. It felt like pretense. But slowly it made sense to me as K-pop continued to grow and expand locally and even worldwide. It was mimicry we have seen many times over in our storied past. Mimicry that not only merely copies but possesses what has been introduced to the local realm, naturalizing it and using it for our own purposes. It is quite easy to get lost, to be rendered invisible by the power of spectacle in K-pop. In spite of this, by way of mimicry, once described by Homi Bhabha as a enemy of presence, the local realm is able to reiterate itself by doubling the images, in this case, of spectacular K-pop groups and practices, and coming up with its own impressions or versions of the spectacle and even of fandom. Thus, P-pop is an important signifier in this process of acculturation, which serves Philippine creative expression in an ever-changing global setting. P-pop is but a new expression of local response to dominant foreign influences. Historically, this local response may be seen in many instances such as that of traditional Filipino theater, like the Komedia or the Moro-Moro, religious drama, the Zarzuela, published narrative forms like the awit and the corrido, the novel, foremost of which is Rizal's Noli and Fili, which sparked the revolution against Spain, and various forms that emerged from radio, film, and television. Now, to answer, for what purpose? I say, depending on the context. The use of locations as teleseries settings, Sanjupsalgi as fiesta, and P-pop serve purposes required by our global realities. The local cannot anymore delay this encounter, this contact, this permeation of global cultures, for these have become part of our everyday lives. We touch base with the world as we follow Korean novella forms and business models, eat the way Koreans do and eat what they eat, and create fandoms and stands out of our own equally original and talented P-pop stars. This is the story so far of the Korean turn in our capacity to engage our South Korean cultural experiences for acculturation into our own cultural formations. But where is the story headed? My hunch is that we're up for an exciting part. Quite recently, the dramatic climax in The Broken Marriage Vow, that of the confrontation among the protagonists at a dinner table, has found itself being repurposed for the campaign of Vice President Leni Robredo and Senator Kiko Pangilinan. Key parts of the dialogue have been spliced into songs and posters associated with the campaign. This was after memes and TikTok videos came up, giving the dialogue many afterlives. I ruminate about what it means now. No? This section which says, papunta pa lang tayo sa exciting part. Which exciting part is it foretelling with regards to the national and local elections on Monday? Well, before we get ahead of ourselves and before things get messy, allow me a last reiteration. We've been picking up so much from South Koreans, including this piece of dialogue first crafted in a Korean novella. It seems to be reminding us that only in struggle shall we overcome. What kind of exciting part shall we write? Abangan ang susunod na kabanata. For now, this is our story so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sir Sanchez, for that wonderful discussion about Hallyu as soft power and its implications in the Philippines. Now let us open the floor for questions from our delegates and speakers about our keynote. You may send your questions through the comments in our live chats. You may also utilize the thumbs up feature to upvote a question so it may be addressed by our speakers. Thank you. Hello po, sir. Something I got from your talk was very interesting, like the influence, how much Korean culture has influenced what's going on in the Philippines. And in your opinion, sir, what do you think is, since there are so many things that we were able to pick up from South Korea in terms of culture, traditions, what do you think is the most influential or most important thing that so far we have taken for our own practices from South Korea?
Well, I think most of the things that we have picked up may be seen in the way we practice our popular culture. So, my area is television studies, so I have studied teleseries. And as I've said, no, in 2013, no, there's already a Korean turn taking place. No, like our soap operas are beginning to look like or beginning to feel like Korean novellas. And I think it is something that's very important because we are also participating in the global drama market. We are selling our teleseries abroad, no? Like K-drama no? Like the producers of K-drama. So, that takes a lot of discussion to do, no? Like, how does it actually look like, when you study, a teleserye? no? Meanwhile, there is also music. All right, we're seeing a lot of things, no, coming out in our music industry that are patterned after K-pop, K-pop models, no? And even the fandom are starting to look like, the way we follow our idols, no, our K-pop idols, no. Sa tingin ko doon, mas nakikita natin, no, yung mga natututuhan natin, no, from the Koreans, no. But I think, no, what is not really, I think, not observed, no, much is we are learning a lot, no, from the soft power strategy of South Korea. All right, we are learning that this is actually the way to go, where as far as globalization is concerned. If you want to have impact in the world and to the world, all right, it takes a lot of work and a lot of investment. All right, kasi alam naman natin sa Korea, no, hindi yun hindi ito lang, no, yung mga efforts kaya merong mga K-drama, kung may mga K-pop, hindi lang ito dahil doon sa mga producers, no. Ito ay may suporta ng estado, no. And I think that's something that we are learning, no. And from that, no, I think we are now being able, no, to lobby, for state support, no, for our artists and our cultural products, no, for them to be trained, no, the way, for example, the Koreans are trained. All right, and then we are also able to see the possibilities of an international market. So hindi na lang tayo nakatingin sa local market, no? Although sabi ko nga, no, in another occasion, no, ang difference natin sa Pilipinas is that when we show teleseries abroad, we have already a captive market. No, there are a lot of Filipinos abroad who would be subscribing to to Filipino channels, right? So meron ng market, no? Pero nakita natin na hindi lang yung Filipino market, no, yung ating dapat na itap, no? Kasi marami pang ibang markets na may interest, no, sa ating mga cultural products. So nakita natin yan doon sa mga teleseries na sumikat sa Southeast Asia, sa Africa, and now I think, no, there are good number of teleseries making waves in Latin America, no? And let's remember, historically, Latin America started it all here, no? The idea that we could actually compete with them in the global drama market, there's so much that we are learning, from South Korea, as far as business models and cultural policies are concerned.
Oh, thank you for that, sir. We have a couple of questions already from our YouTube viewers. Here's the first one. Good afternoon, sir. How can we create our own brand of teleserye or film industry while adapting Korean dramas? Do you think K-dramas hinder our own culture of teleseries at some point?
I want to answer the second question first. No, I think K-dramas are not really hindering, but actually enhancing. The look, the narrative, the format of our teleseries, because this is now the benchmark, no? Parang we have a benchmark, so to speak, no? And historically, and I always look at things historically, we've been learning for the past decades, no, on how to improve our teleseries. So we started out with the Latin American model, and then the the Chinese and the Taiwanese models, and finally the Korean models. We have been innovating, and this is actually something that is lost to a lot of people who look down on teleseries. Pagka nanood ka talaga ng teleserye, makikita mo ang dami na nagbago sa teleserye. Parang lagi nating complain sa teleserye paulit-ulit, pero siguro kasi ang tagal mo nang hindi nakapanood ng teleserye, ang dami-dami na rin nangyayari sa mga teleserye. Now, the first question that was given here is, how can we create our own brand of teleserye while adapting Korean dramas? I think it's very important to distinguish ourselves or distinguish our products as Filipino. So we should not pretend that we are telling a different kind of story. This is the Filipino story. At ganun din naman yung mga kwento ng mga Latin Americans saka noong mga Koreano, and even very underrated nowadays, the soap operas or the series from Turkey, which is being shown in a local channel. They're basically talking about their cultures, So I think very important indicators yung sense of place natin, di ba? Parang pinapakita natin kung ano yung Pilipinas. Pinapakita rin natin kung ano yung mga Pilipino, kung ano yung kwento ng mga Pilipino, yung mga kaugalian ng mga Pilipino, the entirety of culture. So I think that's very important, to brand, our teleserye or our teleserye industry at that. Especially that, the whole broadcast industry has been transformed by the pandemic and by the ABS-CBN shutdown. We are now in a new realm of broadcasting where the digital platforms may now be used for broadcast. Hindi na lang yung free TV, although sabi ko nga kanina sa aking talk, yung free TV is still the most accessible platform for a lot of people. But we're now seeing a lot a new platform. So we just have to continue doing what we have been doing, because we've been selling, I think, very well, in some countries, in a good number of countries.
Here's the next question from our YouTube comments. From Lady Hazel Peñamora, I wonder if it will be possible for the Philippines to make use of its culture, popular or not, as a soft power too. Will it be as successful as South Korea though?
You have to understand how it works in Korea. Parang in Korea, it's not just the networks and the producers putting together all of these things. Now remember, to mga K-pop stars, they go through a lot of training, di ba? Parang a lot of investment, especially in talent development and in talent management. The state, supports these efforts, So kailangan siguro magkaroon ng pangmalawakang suporta ang estado upang pumantay tayo doon sa South Korea, o makalaban ka sa South Korea. Right now, the efforts are privatized. All right, mostly are happening because of private investments. But if you can actually replicate, the business model that's been going on in Korea, parang hindi ako magtataka kung eventually meron tayong mga P-pop na sisikat, di ba? Parang bakit pa nagkaroon ng BTS? Di ba? Parang lang din yan parang tingin ko merong suporta ng estado, dahil may suporta ng estado, sumisikat siya sa global realm, tapos syempre meron ka mga publicists, mga handlers. If you have it's really all about resources. All right, if your products have resources for massive dissemination like the Koreans, no, especially coming from the state, no, I will not be surprised, no, if we, if we make a breakthrough eventually. But that is yet to be seen. So it's really very important, no, for us to elect a government, no, that has care for arts and culture. All right, because it's only with a very, very robust plan for arts and culture that all of these things are or could be possible.
Now let's move on to the next question from Te Yoshi Yoshi. Hello, sir. Do you think the K-drama wave will also die at some point in time, just like any other trends in the Philippines? Or do you think Korea has cemented their place in our culture?
That's a very good question, no? Because as I've said, no, if we look at it historically, no, like yung Latin American telenovelas, nagsimula sila ng 1995, 1996. By 2000, 2001, patay na sila. No? Parang halos wala na, no? Mga 2003, pawala na sila, phase out na sila, 'di ba? So, ang Korean novela nag-start ng 2003 sa Pilipinas. Tapos ako nag-engage ako sa Korean studies through the Korean novela 2013. So 10 years na yun, ang tagal-tagal na. Tapos ngayon, nagka-permeate na yung mga Korean novelas na papanood na natin sa mga streaming platforms, sa Netflix, hindi na lang sa free TV. Dahil lalo na, iba na yung itsura ng ating free TV. So, lahat naman, tingin ko wala namang forever, no? So, may magpa-plateau din yan at some point, no? Yung mga K-drama, di ba? Kasi, syempre, lalo na sa global cultures, no? Parang, palaging merong bago na lumalabas na very interesting. Alright? And actually, ang pinakamaganda dito sa nangyayari sa Korea, no? Ito no? Parang, ngayon pa lang kasi nangyayari yung di ba? Yung Korean wave in the global scale. Di ba? Ngayon pa lang siya nangyayari. Noong 2013, pinag-uusapan na, ay mamamatay na yung Hallyu. No? Tapos sabi ko, wow, no? Fast forward to 2020, 2022, 2021, 22, sabi ko, ayan ang BTS, di ba? Sumasayaw sa UN, di ba? About the, parang advocating for certain things to the UN. Tapos, the previous year, you had Parasite, winning the Oscars. You have actors and actresses. Alam niyo, yung Korea is a really good model, no? For for disseminating pop culture in the global scale. No? Parang pinagtrabahuhan nila ito, pinag-isipan nila ito. Kaya siya matagal, di ba? Kasi everything is planned gradually. Di ba? So, kung mamamatay siya o magwe-wane siya, posible naman yon kasi wala namang forever sa mga bagay-bagay. No? But, there is much to be studied and appreciated with how Korea did it, di ba? So they were not they are conquering the heart of the hearts and minds of the entire world, not by arms, no, but by popular culture, and it's a very, very effective way, to actually bring your message across. No? So, I appreciate, for example, yung BTS engaging in advocacies, no? Because at least they are aware that they have a very, very big platform, no? So they might as well put it to good use, no? So that's another thing, no? And Koreans, I think, are very much aware, no, of the things that they need to do, no? So that they have some form of staying power. All right? Yung cemented siguro parang katulad nung yung American culture is cemented in our consciousness because we are a colony. Siguro, no? Pero yun nga, no, parang that remains to be seen, no, this death, no, because in 2013 we were talking about it. Well, it's still here, no, we're still talking about Hallyu, no, in 2022.
The next question is from Princess Balagbis. As we try to incorporate some elements of Korean culture in our own craft, are there possible challenges that the Filipino market may encounter?
Well, marami naman talagang challenges, no, kasi we are a new player in the global drama market. I think, no, parang ayun pa lang tayo pinapasok ng Netflix, 'di ba? Yung Netflix very much entrenched na in South Korea, 'di ba? So yung mga Korean drama, yung mga K-drama na pinapanood natin nasa Netflix na. So siguro ang challenge talaga ay magkaroon ng mas malaking suporta, no? Lalo na kung manggagaling yung suporta sa sa estado, 'di ba? Kasi dapat ito no, parang kumbaga yung P-pop, yung mga teleserye, these things have to be considered as representing the country, no? Similar to to athletes, for example, no, na sinusuportahan natin, tinitrain natin. Dapat ganun din yung pagtingin natin, no, doon sa mga teleserye, doon sa mga artista ng na nasa P-pop, no, na parang ito, they represent us, no. So hangga't wala pa yun, 'di ba, parang nandun pa lang din tayo sa level na no, parang pinag-aaralan pa rin natin, 'di ba, kung paano natin maisasama yung mga magagandang aspects, no, ng K-drama sa ating mga teleserye. Pero kung walang push or walang boost from the government, no, parang medyo mahihirapan talaga, no. May mga breakthrough na mangyayari, no, pero hindi siya kasing massive, no, ng ginagawa ng mga Koreano.
Thank you for that, sir. We have time for one last question. Do you have any more questions, anybody? Oh, here we have a comment from Lady. Yes, I agree that we badly need support from the government. When I was in Malikhaing Pagsulat, we sometimes joke around about having no job later on.
Yeah, no, when we talk about the teleserye, we talk about P-pop, even culinary cultures, we're talking about the creative industry, no? So I think there are efforts now to improve on or to help the creative industries, no, by way of legislation. There are efforts, no, to put up a Department of Culture. Of course, these require a lot of appropriation, no? Pero I think it's it's an investment, no, that we can that we should pursue, no? Because we are not just talking to each other, no, we're talking to the world, no. I mean, this is globalization. So we have to find a way, no, to represent ourselves, no, and use our cultural formations or cultural practices, no, to introduce ourselves, no, to engage in the global dialogue.
May pahabol, we have one last question from Irish Sabunod. Since lalapit na po ang elections at papunta pa lang tayo sa exciting part, what do you think about K-dramas shaping our perspective regarding politics?
I was reading a post this morning from Facebook from a professor who's parang commenting on something that has to do with Koreans, no? Koreans, as far as I know, are very, very much aware of their history, no? Kaya tingnan niyo yung mga K-drama, 'di ba, may mga period, may mga period drama sila, no? Meron silang mga historical K-drama. Makikita mo sa isang kultura kung may pagpapahalaga sila sa kanilang kasaysayan. Kung meron silang mga drama, no? Mga popular na drama na tumatalakay sa kanilang mga kasaysayan, no? Unfortunately, hindi pa natin siya nakikita ngayon sa ating mga teleserye, no? Kasi puro kilig-kilig yung mga topic, 'di ba? O kaya mga no, masyado tayong natuwa doon sa 𝐏𝐤𝐥𝐿 ng mga Koreans, yung mga infidelity stories. So, puro infidelity pa rin, hindi tayo makaget over doon sa mga kwento na yun, no? Dahil maalam, no, malalim ang kaalaman, no, at ang hugot ng mga Koreano sa sa kanilang kasaysayan, yung kanilang pagka-break into two countries, 'di ba? Yun yung kanilang angst, no, yung kanilang hugot. Siguro sana yun ang maanuhan natin, no, makuha natin, matutuwa natin from Korea, no? That great sense of history, no? That great sense of awareness, no, about their social affairs, no? And I think yung teleserye naman ginagawa niya naman yon, di ba? Pero kailangan lang siguro mas maging pronounced yung ating yung ating ating awareness, no? At ako, yun ang yun ang aking wish, no, na makita, no, as we use the K-drama as a benchmark, no, for continuously reinnovating our teleserye.
Alright, thank you for that, sir. And thank you everyone for your questions. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for our open forum with Sir Sanchez. We apologize to those questions that we weren't able to ask our speaker due to the time restrictions. If the delegates have any more questions that you would like to ask, you may send it to us so that we can relay it to the speaker. One of our generous sponsors for this event is the Philippine Embassy in Seoul. Did you know that they have a lot of programs you might be interested in? To learn more about the programs, initiatives, and services of the Philippine Embassy towards promoting more active engagement between the Philippines and Korea, you're invited to follow the Embassy's official website and online accounts. Mabuhay! Let us now introduce our second speaker for tonight that will share interesting information to our delegates in the government and diplomacy track. He is an instructor at the Department of History at Ateneo de Manila University, Philippines. He teaches courses on Philippine history, European history, and Korean history. He completed his master's degree in history at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, writing about the Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea. He is currently on leave completing his PhD degree in sociology at La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia, researching on Korean migration to the Philippines. He has written articles and presented in various local and international conferences on Philippine participation in the Korean War and Korean migration to the Philippines. To discuss the treatment of Filipino veterans of PEFTOK in South Korea and the Philippines, let us all welcome Sir Neville J. Manawis.
Good evening. 안녕하세요, 여러분. 저는 Neville Ieyo, 반갑습니다. So for tonight, I won't take up too much of your time. I will be presenting to you about the treatment of Filipino veterans of the PEFTOK in South Korea and the Philippines. So the first few slides I will be sharing with you, it will be about a very brief background on the participation of the Philippines in the Korean War. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so the PEFTOK, or the Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea, okay, was created in the 1950s and 1955 as a response towards the Korean War when North Korea invaded South Korea in the 1950s. The Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea, okay, we sent 5 battalions, okay, from 1950 to 1955. A total of 7,420 combat troops divided into 5 BCTs, or what we call battalion combat teams, were sent towards the Korean War. We had the first one, which is the most popular one, known as the 10th BCT, or the Fighting 10th, followed by the 20th BCT, the Leaders, the 19th BCT, the Avengers, the 14th BCT, the Black Lions, and the 2nd BCT, the Bloodhounds. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the PEFTOK was really, really big during the 1950s. Okay, the Philippines was still recovering from the devastation caused by the Second World War. Okay, there were internal problems that we were facing, such as insurgency from the 𝐏𝐶𝐿. And then when the United Nations called for aid in the Korean War, we answered and we sent all of these troops. So it was really a big deal that time, predominantly because we did not have enough forces in the Philippines to secure our internal security. There were also threat external security. And for the most part, we needed all the money that we have in order to rebuild our country. So in the morning of September 2, 1950, the 10th BCT assembled and marched in front of 60,000 people. And on September 19, 1950, the 1st Filipino battalion arrived in South Korea. The Philippines was involved in the Korean War from the 1950s to the 1955. Next slide, please. Okay, so the PEFTOK suffered a total of 112 casualties and over 300 wounded and 16 missing in action. We participated in major turning points of the war. Okay, from the march to the north, or when we broke out in the Busan perimeter and we were marching towards the 38th parallel and on the way to North Korea, towards the entry of the Chinese. So when the Chinese took part in the war and pushed the UN to withdraw further down south. And the creation, the reestablishment of the 38th parallel, which eventually caused a stalemate. We continued our support to the United Nations forces even during the Armistice Agreement, and we continued the support from the 1950 to 1955 and continued sending aid support to Korea until the 1960s. Okay, next slide, please. We have very famous individuals who took part in this battle, one of which is in the Battle of Myeongdong in Singye. This battle was considered the first battalion or the first battle won by Filipinos in foreign soil. The late Major Maximo Yang served in this, took part in this fight and was basically awarded by the Philippines and the Koreans. And it was really, really one of the first battles won by the Philippines on a foreign soil. Next slide. Also, okay, equally important, okay, we also have the very famous Battle of Yultong, which has cemented the story of the PEFTOK, not only in history books, but also the memory of a lot of Koreans. Okay? The Battle of Yultong saw the 10th BCT, okay, repelling or fighting the onslaught of the Chinese attacks in 1951. And we have one very important soldier named Captain Conrado Yap, who actually risked his life to save, to check on his troops and save the lives of his men, and he was eventually killed in battle. Later on, I'll discuss more about what happened to Captain Conrado Yap and how we were able to commemorate his actions in the Korean War. Next slide, please. I think it's also popular to mention former President Fidel V. Ramos, who served in the 20th BCT and who fought actually in the Battle of 𝐒𝐿-iri in 1952. Okay, this was one of the deadliest battle that was taking place that time, and it was a very, very lengthy battle. Former President Fidel Ramos led Filipino soldiers and assaulted the various hills in 𝐒𝐿-iri, which eventually allowed them to defeat their enemies. Next slide. Okay, now that I've provided you with some idea of what the PEFTOK is all about, okay, we now come to the meat of our discussion, okay, or the main topic of what this presentation is all about, is the treatment of Filipino veterans of the PEFTOK in South Korea and the Philippines. So we divide this part into two. Okay, the first one focuses on the Philippines treatment, or how do we define basically treatment, and second, we look into how the South Koreans were basically approaching the Filipinos in the Korean War. So how do we approach the term treatment? Okay, so is it a treatment in the past, or is it treatment in the present, or are we making the foundations for the future? So what I'll be discussing is all three: the treatment in the past, the treatment in the present, and what we are doing to ensure that we give them fair and right recognitions in the future. How are they remembered? Okay, so the treatment, when I focus here, is focused on how are they remembered. So when we focus on the word remembered, we look into the words how they are supported and how are they honored or recognized. So these five items are the main guiding point or the handrail that we have to explain on how we have treated the Filipinos in the Korean War and how the South Koreans treated the Filipinos in the Korean War. Next slide, please. Okay, well, we have to bring up the uniqueness of the Korean War in Philippine history. Not a lot of people remember that the Philippines participated in the Korean War, and we did not only send soldiers just for decorations in itself, just to show that it was an international concern. We set a battalion combat team who faced numerous battles, numerous withdrawals, and did counteroffensives and participated really in a very, very ugly and very destructive war. The Korean War created a lot of attention and sustained the interest of the Filipinos. So from the 1950s to 1960s, Filipinos were very, very much engaged and interested in the Korean War. The Philippines was deeply involved with the unfolding events behind the Filipino battalions. The Korean War was able to occupy the space in historical narratives in the 1950s, but the problem is that by the 1960s, okay, people did not notice it anymore, and it started to die down. And this is nothing what we call specific in the Philippines. Okay, the Korean War has been named or associated with the Forgotten War. Okay, and because nobody could remember it or nobody could remember what we have done with it, but it's really not true that it was forgotten. Okay, it was just put aside because it was not considered important that time in the historical narratives. But right now, as the Philippines and South Korea started to build more ties, and the Philippines started to develop the diplomatic relations with Korea, these topics of the Korean War started to rise. Okay? In the next slide, please. In the next slide, I would like to show to you a very, very interesting newspaper article. There was massive support in the Korean War. So from the 1950s to 1960s, a lot of people wanted to volunteer and take part in the Korean War. There was an overwhelming public support. Filipinos voiced out for greater action in Korea. Okay, so Filipinos were actually wanting the Philippine government, okay, local officials, senators, everyone, that we need to send more towards Korea. And it's still up to today, I'm still figuring out why is there a huge public support. It's not only coming from soldiers, it was really from the public. One such example was an incident involving hundreds of volunteers who flocked to a movie theater after it falsely advertised that they are recruiting volunteers to be deployed in Korea. Okay, so if we take a look at these narratives, okay, we will see that Filipinos were very interested on something that is happening in Korea. And this is quite perplexing, predominantly because that we don't know anything about Korea that time. Okay? There were little interactions or diplomatic relations and exchanges that was taking place between the Philippines and Korea. But despite all of that, there was a huge, massive public support. So during the Korean War or the course of the Korean, we have been treating our veterans very, very well. And even those soldiers that were being sent, we are giving them the proper send-off that what we need. Next slide, please. If we take a look at the next slide, this is actually, if you can see there, the photos of the fallen Filipino soldiers brought to libingan ng mga bayani. There was such a huge fanfare, there was a huge celebration, and there was a huge attention that was given to the Korean War. And others might say that, oh, this is just a propaganda, and this is just something like for show and everything, but it didn't. It didn't occur that way, okay? Because if we take a look at what was the Filipinos interested that time, it was all about the Korean War. Next slide, please. If you take a look at the next slide, we have produced several movies that talks about Filipino soldiers in the Korean War. This is the first battalion that we sent, and it's entitled the 10th Battalion, sa 38th Parallel in Korea. It was a very popular film. Okay, and succeeding films that talks about the Korean War eventually followed suit. So we were fortunate enough to find photos or images of this film. So next slide, please. And if you can take a look at the next slide, you will see very interesting photos of Filipino soldiers mimicking what was happening in the Korean War. And you can see this is a studio, and we created fake snow. Okay? And our Filipino soldiers were wearing parkas, or basically winter clothing, to mimic what was the Filipino soldiers were experiencing that time in the Korean War. Okay, next slide, please. And if you take a look at the next slide, this is a very interesting account as well. As you can see that we have Filipinos who were dressing up like Koreans. Okay, and this is from what we can surmise from the images, is that this is one of the operations that took place, okay, in which Filipino soldiers were going into the house of Koreans and checking for North Koreans or Chinese who were infiltrating their positions. So it was really a big deal that time. Okay, we spent a lot of money and resources, and it was a commercial success at that point in time. Next slide, please. And it's not only the studios who were helping at this point in time. And as you can see, there was a huge support from the government. The Philippine Army or other BCTs were providing the necessary resources, tanks, weapons, soldiers that time, to make the film very authentic. Okay, and it was a big deal. A lot of people were watching these films at that time. So the treatment was very good. Hey, the Filipino soldiers, the actions in PEFTOK was embedded, and it became very popular amongst the Filipino population. And it didn't end there. The next slide, please. If you take a look at the next slide, this was a very popular film as well, Korea. This was penned by Benigno S. Aquino. Benigno S. Aquino served as a reporter in the Korean War. So here is a story of Filipino soldiers and a Korean waif, okay, played by a Filipina again, and it talks about the life of the Filipino soldiers in the Korean War. And we can still continue from that point, showing more films about the Korean War. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we didn't end there. We even continue with Batalyong Pilipino. And if you can see the red box that I've highlighted there, special announcement, all Army men and ROTC cadets in uniform, half price during the entire exhibition of this picture. So we've already seen roughly around 3 movies that deals with the Korean War. So they wouldn't have continued these if it was not popular at that point in time. And it was a commercial success, and people still followed the events that took place in the Korean War. The last thing I want to show you in terms of film is this one. Okay, it's called the next slide, please. Okay, the Ulilang Between, that talks about also a Filipino soldier marrying a Korean and bringing her back towards the Philippines. Okay, this actually mimics one of the first migrations that happened in the Philippines, okay, right after the Korean War. Okay? So all of this became very popular, and not all of this were action films. Some of this, most of this, were dramas, like the Batalyong Pilipino, the Ulilang Between. Okay, it was a drama. It's a drama piece. Okay, so at this point in time, the 1950s and 1960s, okay, we were falling in love with topics about Korea itself, more specifically the Korean War. But after the 1960s, people started to refocus their attention. And it's nothing surprising, predominantly because of the exit of the Philippines in the Korean War, okay, happened, okay, unceremoniously, if I may add to that. And also, there was an abrupt end in the Korean War. It was a stalemate. Okay, we were back in the 30th parallel, and nobody knew what was happening already and what is going to happen after that. But commemorating and remembering the Filipino soldiers in the Philippines did not end there. Next slide, please. If we take a look at these images in the next slide, okay, these are, I'm not sure if all of you have seen this. Okay, the first one that I would like to show is the Marikorea Monument. Okay, this is a monument that can be found in Marikina. Okay, it's called Marikorea Monument because this is where most of the Filipino soldiers that were sent towards the Korean War started their training. The 10th BCT used this area as for their target practice for their tanks. Okay, so several years ago, this monument was basically created to commemorate the Filipino soldiers that joined or participated in the Korean War. So if you have time, please look into it, and it will somehow remind you of the history that we are starting to rediscover again. Another very interesting statue that a lot of people don't know is the statue of the Sentinel of Freedom. This can be found near Rizal Park. Okay, this was subject to a lot of controversy that time, predominantly because it was supposed to be not built near Rizal Park, and why are we putting the statue of Lapu-Lapu there, and so forth and so forth. But people actually forgot that this statue of the Sentinel of Freedom, if you take a look at the plaque that is embedded here, it is dedicated also to the Filipino soldiers who served in the Korean War. Okay, so we have all of these markers that can be found all throughout the Philippines that gives attention or allows Filipinos to rediscover on what we really have accomplished, or even remind us a bit of our participation in the Korean War. Next slide, please. Okay. Almost close to 10 years ago, it's very fortunate that we have the PEFTOK Korean War Memorial in Taguig City. It is actively promoting the legacy of the PEFTOK. It is a very good place to know about the PEFTOK. It is a repository of different artifacts, weapons, information, books, and other resource speakers that talks about the Korean War and the Philippines' participation, which is very, very good. Okay, when I started doing my research before on the Korean War, this haven't existed, and was very difficult to find where we can find sources about the Korean War. Next slide, please. Okay. For those who know about the military, okay, this is known as the YAP Hall that can be found in the Philippine Military Academy in Baguio. If I'm not mistaken, this is what you call something like the mess hall of the PMA. Okay, a lot of cadets know this because this is where they take solace sometimes. But this is named after Captain Conrado Yap, okay, who fought in the Korean War, and which I showed earlier, who became a hero in the Battle of Yultong. Fast forward a couple of years, okay, or a few years ago, next slide, please. Okay, Captain Conrado Yap was also commemorated again in the BRP Conrado Yap. It's a Pohang class vessel that we received from South Korea, which helped enhance our maritime capabilities. And it was named again towards Captain Conrado Yap. Okay, so we all have these necessary markers that we have. Okay, furthermore, next slide, please. We have what we call the Philippine Veterans Affairs. Okay, it provided support not only to other veterans, but also the PEFTOK, and it provided support for their descendants. It organized various activities to recognize and remember their actions in the Korean War, and coordinate with South Koreans for various supports activities, scholarships, and support. Okay, so the Philippine Veterans Affairs are very, very active in doing so, such as yearly commemorations of the participation of the Philippines in the Korean War, and also the Battle of Yultong. Next slide, please. So this is some of the commemorations that took place. And even during the pandemic, these commemorations and remembrance even took place. So we didn't, what we call that, we were diligent enough, and also we have played a huge part in terms of remembering. Okay, but it is understood, or we understand, that more needs to be done. Okay, especially that we are strengthening our ties with South Korea, and also bridging ties with other countries. It is good to remember on what we have accomplished in the Korean War. Now we go to the second part of this so-called treatment, and we now go towards how about now the Koreans for their end. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. It is true that many Koreans still remember, okay, the sacrifices of the Filipino soldiers in the Korean War. When I regularly visit Korea, okay, and especially for the older generations, okay, when they heard, when they know or remember the Philippines, they always talk about how Filipino soldiers helped them during the Korean War. They experienced something, good memories about Filipino soldiers in the Korean War, and they always thank the service of the Philippines in sending forces towards the Korean War. The Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs in South Korea, okay, is the one in charge to continue the celebration and remembrance of the Korean War. They work hand in hand with the local government in the Philippines and local agencies to create memorial projects, okay, revisit programs, and other memorial projects in South Korea as well. Next slide. Okay, so this is one of the Philippine monuments that we can find in South Korea. Okay, there are many monuments that can be found there, specifically tailored to some battalions. Okay, and there are some burial sites. Okay, also, and there are many monuments that commemorate the actions of the Filipino soldiers as they traverse from north to south in the Korean Peninsula. Okay, next slide. This is another Philippine monument that can be found in South Korea, and this monument is erected to somehow give or to remember or give importance in the Battle of Yultong Ridge. Okay, so there are many dedications and there are many monuments to help remind, okay, not only the Filipinos but Koreans, and it's very exciting and also humbling experience when Filipinos visit these monuments, because it will give you a sense of greater appreciation and humility of what we have accomplished that time in the 1950s when the Philippines was basically struggling. We were actually helping a country defend itself. Okay, next slide. Okay, South Korea continued its support, especially also with the veterans. Okay, they were close contact with the Philippine Veterans Affairs, and they continued to provide support towards the veterans. In the COVID-19 pandemic, or when the COVID-19 pandemic started, okay, South Korea sent care packages, masks, and other medical equipment to the Filipino soldiers. Okay, and other Filipino veterans, and you can see these pictures. It was given to them, and it was something like to remember the sacrifices that the Filipino soldiers has made. Next slide, please. Okay. There are also revisit and exposure programs. Okay, South Koreans are bringing veterans and their families and other generations, okay, towards Korea, just to remind them, okay, of the sacrifices that they have made and how they help contribute to making South Korea as free and as prosperous as this point in time. Okay, next slide. And this is a very interesting context. Okay, there is continued social cultural activities. Okay, education support for their descendants, revisit, and South Korean activities. South Korea has yearly been commemorating, okay, the Philippines' participation in the Korean War, and there are still continued activities that usually extend, okay, the welcome and thank you towards all of the Filipinos who took part in the Korean War. Next slide. This is not a very well-known story, okay, but this is a very heartwarming story, and I was very fortunate enough to talk to some of the Korean soldiers who actually participated here. There was a continued aid to the Philippines and develop an economic aid and regional security. So let's start first with this picture. Okay, this picture are Korean soldiers that were sent to the Philippines during the Typhoon Haiyan. Okay, one of the most destructive typhoons that ever hit not only the Philippines but in the different parts of the world. And when a lot of aid was pouring into the Philippines, South Korea actually sent a team of Korean soldiers, okay, engineers, and doctors, and they were there to repay the okay, somewhat return the gratitude towards the Filipinos for taking part in the Korean War. So they stayed there, helped build houses. And I was able to talk to one after many years after that, and they said they were actually looking for houses of PEFTOK veterans, and they wanted to help build all of these things. So this symbolisms and these aid that was given is a very good gesture. Okay, some of these Korean soldiers were actually lived in the Philippines for quite a while, so they know how to speak Filipino, and they were very, very supportive on the rehabilitation and reconstruction efforts that was taking place in the Philippines. Okay, so it is embedded to them about what the Philippines has done to South Korea, and they wanted to continue this relationship and continue providing infinite thank you towards the Philippines. We continuously get aid from South Korea, okay, in the form of loans, in the form of equipment, in the form of developmental projects. And when you take a look at all of the speeches that was taking place about this aid that was taking place, it will always mention that they want to repay or they want to help out because the Philippines took part in the Korean War in the 1950s when South Korea was really, really in a very difficult situation. Next slide, please. And in the last few slides that I would like to show to you, it's just more of the commemorations. In the past few years, there is the 𝐸𝐸 Cordon of the Order of the Military Merit. It was awarded to Major Maximo Yang and also given towards Captain Conrado Yap. Okay, so continuously, South Korea is still honoring, okay, the Filipino soldiers and their efforts or their memory in itself towards our participation and also our sacrifices in the Korean War. Okay? If you go to South Korea, next slide, please. Okay? It is not surprising that if when you go to South Korea, you encounter this very, very humbling, at the same time ominous and large structure. It's the Korean War Museum, which houses all the artifacts, research, and also stories about all of those who participated in the Korean War. Next slide, please. Okay, we will also see this monument. And so this slide is basically, oh, sorry, could you go back one slide, please? Okay. I would like to, next slide. Okay, that is renewed attention. Okay, so if you can see this is a picture of me in the Korean War Museum, and you can see my daughter, who is not very much into history and watching on her iPad. Okay, there's a new renewed attention towards the treatment of veterans and can be described as an ebb and flow, meaning our treatment to the veterans in terms of what I mentioned earlier about remembering them and valuing all of them. Okay, initially there was a big interest, and then suddenly it got lost, and then there was a huge interest again, and then eventually got lost. But right now there's a huge interest towards South Korea, and with this interest in South Korea, people started to look into what is our relationship with South Korea, and then we will always come across the PEFTOK, or this is when we started to aid South Korea in the Korean War. So this is basically one of the most important points in the two nations' history. It was seen as a bridge to strengthen the connection between the Philippines and South Korea, and it is important in understanding its value. Next slide, please. Okay, the treatment towards veterans can be described as renewed appreciation. So this is the last slide I would like to show you. It's basically a renewed appreciation. When I started doing the research in the PEFTOK back in 2001 to 2003, there was little attention that was given to it. Okay, people didn't pay much attention to it. And then after a few years, still not much attention. But when the Korean wave, there was an increased migration in the Philippines and interest Korea happened, people started asking the questions, what is our relationship with Korea? And these very questions that we ask is also being asked by Koreans. Okay, how are we connected to the Philippines? And it all boils down to one thing. Okay, the rediscovery of the Philippine and South Korean accomplishment and friendship. We had our friendship and support that is embedded and can be seen in the battlefields of Korea. And we are closely tied to them because we aided a country who was asking for help. And this is now a country who wanted to repay its repay for our generosity. Okay, so there was more involvement in the Philippines and South Korean relationship, and that is why the future is actually much brighter than before in terms of valuing, remembering, and rediscovering, okay, our relationship that took place in the Korean War. Okay, next slide. And this is where I end my discussion. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you, sir, for that insightful discussion on the treatment of Filipino veterans of PEFTOK in South Korea and the Philippines. Moving on, we are opening the floor for questions from our delegates and viewers. You may send your questions through the comment sections in our live chats. Be sure to identify who your question is addressed to. You may also utilize the thumbs up feature to upvote the question so it may be addressed by our speakers. Thank you. Our first question is, good evening, sir. I'm really interested in the films you discussed. I wonder if they're still available, and if yes, where can we possibly watch them?
Okay, it's very difficult to find. I've been doing my best to find all of these materials, and I've been working with some Koreans who are actually very interested in looking for this. When I discover this, I will let everyone know because it's very important piece of history, and I believe that it's somewhere just out there or somebody has a copy of it. But currently, we do not have any access to this, but we have leads on where we can find all of this, and we will share all of our findings to everyone.
Here's the next question from another YouTube viewer, Macy C. I don't know much about the Korean War and the Philippines' contribution in this since it wasn't mentioned in my history classes. I was wondering what was in it for us. Why did we get involved?
Okay, very good question. Okay, let me approach that into two parts. Okay, one of the things that we really don't know and we're still discovering right now, why was there a huge public support? Okay, we're not talking about the government itself, we're talking about regular citizens, and they are very, very much willing to participate in the Korean War. They've sent letters towards the government to don't only send medical or military aid, we need to send all of these troops. So why was there a huge interest in the Korean War that time? Okay, so if I have to answer that question, it's predominantly because, well, some people will mention that the US was taking part in it, so we should take part in it because there was a strong attachment to the United States military that time. The second, it was the fight against communism. Okay, so the fight in Korea is also the fight amongst Filipinos, and the third one is that there was seen as a certain attachment, okay, in towards what was happening in Korea. Okay, even though we know so very little about Korea, we felt that the hardships that were taking place there is also the fight amongst Filipinos. Now we go on towards the government itself. Okay, initially it was very difficult for the Philippines to decide on the Korean War or participating in the Korean, because what is it in for us? Okay, when we sent our soldiers towards the Korean War, okay, nobody could really understand, okay, what was happening and what benefit will be given towards the Philippines. And it did not happen immediately. It happened a couple of months or the year after that. Okay, if we can remember, in 1950, after we sent in 1950, in 1951, we received so much U.S. support in terms of aid, loans, and donations, and even weapons in the Philippines. And a lot of scholars have argued that this is connected because the Philippines participated in the Korean War. The Philippines participating in the Korean War created the idea that the Korean War was an international affair. And the Americans were pushing it forward, and by showing support, the Americans have actually given us some of the material and military aid that we needed. Moreover, if we take a look at the Mutual Defense Treaty from the Philippines and the United States, it was signed a year after the Philippines participated in the Korean War. It can be associated with a coincidence, or it can be seen as a very good bargaining chip by the Philippine government that time, that if we participate, we want guarantees and securities with the Americans. And that mutual defense treaty still exists up to today, and it is what we've been using ever since in order to enhance our external security.
All right, here's the next question. After PEFTOK, are there any significant security agreements between South Korea and the Philippines?
Well, we have to remember when we participated in the PEFTOK, it was under the flag of the United Nations. Okay? It was a police action, okay, that we participated in the United Nations. Okay, the agreements that we have with South Korea is always going to go through with the United Nations. Okay, if you're going to talk about any significant security agreements, okay, that time, it was always coursed towards the United Nations and also the US government that time. But the Philippines has expressed, okay, time and time again from the 1955 to 1960 that if anything that happens in Korea again, the Philippines will be willing to participate.
The next question, what are the primary and secondary sources to engage more in PEFTOK?
Okay, very good question. Okay, well, primary source the best primary source has always been talking to Filipino veterans, and there's still a lot of them. Okay, we've barely scratched the surface in terms of research. Okay, the research that I've done before was focused on the 1st Battalion, the 10th BCT. There's still 4 more battalions, and sad to say, a lot of our veterans are already in old age. So it's very important to engage with them right now, to get their story, to build the narratives what we have. It's not important, it's urgent right now to write articles or to publish things or to put them in vlogs and everything. What is important is to get their side of the story, get all their narratives about the life of the soldiers in the battlefields in Korea, and then once they return. Okay, so those are very important primary sources. The second primary source that we can, the second one is the secondary source, is that there are limited books and materials about the Korean War. Okay, there's too few that is written, but there are still some. Okay, such as newspaper articles, okay, about correspondence and other magazine interviews can be present. Adding to the list of sources is that in the US, there are also after battle records. Okay, once a Filipino conducts battles, okay, there are reports that are generated and conducted, and it is basically archived. So we barely looked into these archives, and we haven't seen a lot of what was the impact on all of this. If you want to go in or study even that hasn't barely touched or barely looked into, there are lots of documents among South Koreans. Okay? But the South Koreans' records are all written in Hangul. So it's very difficult. So we need to translate them. Moreover, if we really also want to take a look at the other side of the story, we can also take a look at the records coming from the Chinese, which they have started to slowly release. What did they think about the Filipinos at this point in time? How did we fight? How did we move? Okay, did we accomplish what we had? Is really the Battle of Yultong truly the representative of what our veterans are basically saying? So there's a lot of sources right now. We just really need to engage with them.
The next question is from Eman Velasquez. I would like to ask how the UN command valued the PEFTOK soldiers during the war. What are some of the perception they have towards the Filipino soldiers, particularly after Yultong?
Okay, prior to Yultong, the Filipino soldiers are, it can be said in a good way or a bad way, okay? The 10th PCT soldiers always mentioned that they are cannon fodder, meaning they were placed in front. They are always fighting in front. They think that the other soldiers want to place us in front so they won't get hurt. So we're always becoming a cannon fodder or being placed in the front lines to fight the enemy. But as they started to realize, okay, that they're being placed there because they were efficient, that they were good, okay, they were always accomplishing this mission that is given to them. So the UN command has high respect with Filipino soldiers. There were some difficulties with the UN command, especially with when winter started to set in. Okay, when the Filipino soldiers arrived in September, we were marching all the way to North Korea in the month of December. So we really didn't have any winter clothing. And all of you who've been to Korea knows that winter in South Korea and even North Korea is no joke. So the Filipinos were wearing only fatigue and all of those things. So we had a lot of difficulties with our supplies, and that's created some conflict with the United Nations. But overall, okay, we can surmise the fact that we are always being used and employed by the UN command shows that we are effective, and we can accomplish all of our missions that are given to us. When the Battle of Yultong ended, there was a huge respect well, there was huge respect already in the Filipinos before the Battle of Yultong. We wouldn't be brought in the Battle of Yultong or the Yultong area if they knew that we were going to collapse or be defeated. But right after the Battle of Yultong, a few days after that, we were brought back again in the battlefield to conduct a rescue mission. If they did not have any high regard for us, we wouldn't have been employed so many times in the battlefield in the shifting border battlefields that time in North and South Korea.
Here is another question. Do you think this needs a bit more emphasis in the curriculum of Philippine history, or are there not enough records and sources to use?
Well, I'm speaking here in behalf of a history teacher at the same time as a Korean history teacher and also as a Korean War historian. Okay, we can mention it in Philippine history, but there's just so many things that we need to mention or discuss. Okay, it's usually important to show this in passing, okay, or discuss a bit, okay, predominantly because of history is somewhat reflective of what is taking place in the present. So we can inject this with the interest of the Filipinos towards Korea can always be seen in the past. And this can be seen basically in towards the Korean War, in which I have emphasized earlier on. We were such fans in the Korean War even before we started to understand what Korea is all about. Okay? And now it's not going to be surprising. We are so interested in Korea right now when every one of us knows a lot of things about Korea altogether. But it wouldn't hurt to include this in the curriculum in Philippine history. It's just a matter of how we are going to place it, or how are we going to tell it or insert in the narrative that we are talking about.
All right, here's the next question from Mabel Alvarez. Good evening, sir. What pushes for both countries to work together in order to achieve a certain goal? What other aims or goals they want to continue till now and for the coming years?
Well, like any other country, they're always looking for ways to bridge gaps with other countries. Okay? And by bridging this gap, it allows greater strengthening and development in terms of economy, politics, regional security, environmental awareness, and such. And this is one of the goals that South Korea and the Philippines have. South Korea is very much interested in the Philippines, not because of economic investment or political investment and all of these things, but there's a genuine interest in the Philippines, predominantly because of what we have done in the Korean War. And it's not only happening in the Philippines, it's happening also to other countries that sent soldiers towards the Korean War. So these goals and aims are very much necessary and in line with each other. Tourism itself is big in the Philippines, and we are always being marketed as being part of the Korean War. And all of the speeches that we have in connecting towards Korea has always been mentioning the Korean War itself. So this is a way for us to bridge the gaps and attain our goals altogether.
Here's the next question. Magandang gabi, sir. We all know that there is still tension between North and South Korea. Does South Korea have any measures to protect Filipino immigrants in case a war transpires?
Okay, one thing good about history is we're predominantly focused on the past. Okay, so this is basically the future itself, and we can say that North Korea and South Korea will always have tensions with each other. Does South Korea have any measures to protect the Filipino immigrants? Yes, there is measures that to protect not only Filipino immigrants but all of those living in South Korea. Are there plans for the Philippine government to help Filipino immigrants that are there, that are working there? Yes, there are plans on how to help the Filipinos there. Are there plans if the Philippines is going to participate in the war that is going to happen? We will let the next administration deal with that and decide if we're going to participate on that.
Having been raised in Korea, I've observed intergenerational trauma manifesting among Koreans and how military service is considered a right of manhood. How beneficial is it for the Philippine government to implement mandatory military service?
Well, I would just leave that towards other experts who can decide on that manner. It's a very highly contentious decision. Okay, it's a very highly contentious for me to decide to mention that because uh, it depends upon what our trajectory is. And what do you mean by military service in itself, and then what is that mandatory itself? How long will it be? Something like or similar towards Korea itself. So I'll just like to defer that question to other individuals who have much more knowledge on the political issues and also the logistical issues behind that.
Okay, do the veterans receive enough support and compensation from the Philippine government, and do they get something from the Korean government also?
Yes, they do get support from the Korean government, and yes, they in the Philippines they are given the support that is dictated under the law, and also dictated by the programs that we have for our veterans. Okay, well, there it might not be enough. Okay, but it will always never be enough. Okay, but our programs are there to continuously support the veterans that we have in the Philippines.
Here's the next question is from 𝐒𝐨𝐵𝐿. Veterans are at some point the least credited and least remembered individuals. What are the future plans of the government to further promote in the educational curriculum and give veterans rightful credit?
Okay, so if we're gonna localize this only towards the Filipino-Korean War veterans. I don't want to talk about in general about those brave young men and women that are serving in the military right now, protecting our territory. So we're just gonna localize this only on the Filipino soldiers who serve in the Korean Wars. The veterans, when I talk to the veterans, they always mention that they feel important already because they served in the Korean War. Okay, those Filipino soldiers feel that they don't feel that they are heroes in the way. They feel that they were doing heroic things and they were serving a group of heroic peoples. Okay, so for them, acknowledgement of being part of that group is strong enough. Okay, when I talk to these veterans, that they feel that they have already been credited, okay, because they haven't let down the soldiers in their foxholes that were fighting alongside with them. Okay, but for us watching them, okay, should we give much more interest in them? Should the government promote and everything? Yes, I do feel that the government needs to do more, but we are doing it already. The government is doing it already. There are so much infrastructures that are being built to remind the Filipinos about the Korean War veterans. Okay, and it's not only in education curriculum, okay, that they can be alive. It can be as simple as talking to the veterans, and we do give credit to them. We have annual activities for the PEFTOK, okay, and we do give commemorations for all of them. Okay, there's streets that are named after Korean War veterans and so forth. Okay, it's more about rediscovering the government efforts or what we have been doing to support our Korean War veterans and to support their memory.
Does the Ministry of Education of South Korea disseminate the historical Battle of Yultong to the Korean students upon now?
Okay, well, the Battle of Yultong is a very specific event that happened in the Korean War. Okay, as I've shown you, there are many battles that took place in the Korean War because all of you know the terrain in Korea, it's very hilly. So there are many battles that took place. So for us, the Battle of Yultong is very, very important. Okay, it is also important to them, but it is somewhat selected discussions. For example, you live in an area close to the Yultong area or near those monuments, it is eventually discussed or mentioned.
That seems to be the last question. So, does anyone have any more questions? Because we still have a lot of time. Okay, once, twice. Okay, wala na. Thank you everyone for your questions. We apologize to those questions that we wouldn't be able to ask our speakers. And if the delegates have any more questions that you would like to ask, you may send it to us so that we can relay it to the speaker. With that, our keynote lectures for the government and diplomacy track officially concludes. We hope that our delegates learned a thing or two and were able to broaden their knowledge about South Korea and Philippine diplomacy from our esteemed speakers. Before we formally say our goodbyes for tonight, we would like to call once again our esteemed speakers, Sir Sanchez and Sir Manawis, to be given a certificate of appreciation. First, this certificate reads, "This certificate of appreciation is hereby given to Louis John A. Sanchez for imparting their valuable knowledge and insights during the 2022 Philippine-Korean Youth Forum, organized by 𝐕𝐵 and co-organized by 𝐕𝐵 Research Center, Pinoy Scholars sa Korea, Association of Filipino Educators in Korea, Busan University of Foreign Studies, United Korean Community Association in the Philippines, and Office of International Linkages Diliman, 𝐕CAA UP Diliman. Given the 6th day of May 2022, signed by Lady Hazel V. Peñamora, the President of 𝐕𝐵 and Dr. Kyungmin the Advisor of 𝐕𝐵. Thank you, Sir Sanchez. Likewise to our second speaker, this certificate of appreciation is hereby given to Neville J. Manawis for imparting their valuable knowledge and insights during the 2022 Philippine-Korean Youth Forum, organized by 𝐕𝐵 and co-organized by 𝐕𝐵 Research Center, Pinoy Scholars sa Korea, Association of Filipino Educators in Korea, Busan University of Foreign Studies, United Korean Community Association in the Philippines, and the Office of International Linkages Diliman, 𝐕CAA UP Diliman. Given this 6th day of May 2022, signed by Lady Hazel V. Peñamora, the President of 𝐕𝐵 and Dr. Kyungmin, the Advisor of 𝐕𝐵. Thank you, sir.
감사합니다, 여러분.
And that ends the third series of our keynote lectures for PKYF 2022. We hope that all of the delegates, especially those in the government and diplomacy track, as well as other viewers in the Facebook and YouTube Live, were enlightened and gained something from our esteemed speakers. Before we close the live stream, we'd like to ask all the participants in our Facebook and YouTube Live to answer our evaluation form for today. Remember, this is required for us to validate your attendance in the session. The link to the evaluation form is on the screen. We will also be sending this link in the comment sections. Moreover, we would like to remind our delegates in the government and diplomacy track that their respective plenary sessions and workshop will be tomorrow, May 7, from 1 to 4:30 p.m. Kindly message your respective group facilitator in your GC if there would be any questions. Thank you everyone for attending today's keynote lectures for the government and diplomacy track. Hopefully, you could all also apply the learnings when making decisions such as who you'll be voting for in this election. Remember to vote wisely. Have a great Friday night, everybody. Thank you.